Hello and welcome to Today's Take, hosted by me, Jane Azzopardi, the podcast that goes beyond the headlines to give you the story behind the story that you see on TV. And this week, Australia marked the 50th anniversary of one of the most defining events of our political history.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
Live now to Today Federal Politics reporter Liz Daniels at Old Parliament House, where those famous words were uttered. Liz, Anthony Albanese has paid homage to the former PM.
He has, and he's promising to commission a statue in honour of Gough Whitlam and to commemorate what was such a stern test of our democracy. It was on these steps 50 years ago that Gough Whitlam delivered that speech. His government had been sacked, the Parliament dissolved, and the then opposition leader Malcolm Fraser had been installed as the caretaker Prime Minister, a series of events that became a watershed moment in Australian politics, but one that Anthony Albanese last night described as a calculated Conservative plot.
Make no mistake, November the 11th, 1975 was not a constitutional crisis. It was a partisan political ambush.
A scathing assessment of history from our Prime Minister. There will be a series of events here at Old Parliament House today. Two former Prime Ministers, Keating and Howard, will be here, and we are awaiting the arrival, Jane, of the Governor-General, Sam Mostyn, no doubt to get a much more friendly reception today than John Kerr did half a century ago.
Yes, those immortal words from Gough Whitlam echoed around the nation again on Tuesday. So let's dive into not just the history, but the current relevance of that defining moment with Nine's political editor, Charles Croucher. Charles, welcome to Today's Take.
Hey Jane, nice to be back.
It's funny, isn't it? I mean, neither of us was alive in 1975, and yet those words uttered by Gough Whitlam on the steps of Old Parliament House are still so familiar to both of us.
They are, and I think it's familiar to anyone who knows anyone that was alive at that time. It was amazing going through the process and hearing so many stories about where different people were when they heard the news of Gough Whitlam being sacked. So many people I spoke to on this week and in the lead up spoke about being in school and having either hearing it on the radio or having a teacher run in and tell them this had gone on. Some of the people in Canberra spoke about being sent home from school because it was such a big event. And then the turmoil that not just followed because of how unusual it was, but preceded. This was an unusual government. 3 years, so much reform, such a stark contrast to the 2 decades before, not just in style, but in the fact that it was a different party for the first time in a long time as well. It is the kind of tumultuous years that are summarised by Gough's line, but also that mantra of, you crash through or you crash. And in so many ways, Gough Whitlam did both. The final crash came probably on November 11, 1975, and that's what makes it such a special date for Australians and something that you and I would speak about that kids still learn about at school today, and I don't think that's going to end anytime soon because of the significance. Yeah,
I mean, I know you're a political history buff, but for people who don't really remember their school lessons, can you just bring us up to speed of the history of it? What actually happened? We've heard of the dismissal. What actually happened and why?
It got to the stage where the Whitlam government, who went in with a pretty workable majority in the Senate, but during 1975 lost a senator from Queensland died, and then the Bjelke-Petersen government, who was the Premier at the time in Queensland, replaced the Labor senator with someone who notionally was a card-carrying Labor member, but wasn't one that was going to back Gough Whitlam. So it became crucial in effectively stacking the Senate against the government. And then they got to the stage where the government couldn't pass the budget and couldn't pass what's known as supply. John Howard, I spoke to during the commemorations, and he was very adamant they didn't block supply, they just kept deferring it, and that was a different thing altogether. But I mean, the effect was that the government couldn't get its money bills through the Parliament. It couldn't get all the bills and all the necessary legislation to pay for everything that's going on. And so the Governor-General took the position that if supply can't get through the Parliament, that's an indication that the government can't work. He sacked the Prime Minister and installed the opposition leader as the caretaker Prime Minister and had an election, I think 3 or 4 weeks later, which the opposition leader, Malcolm Fraser, who was the acting Prime Minister, won really comfortably, so he became Prime Minister. It is something we've never seen before and never seen since. The representative of the Crown stepping in and sacking the elected, democratically elected Prime Minister. It's a strange situation, a quirk of our system, and something I kind of hope we don't see again as well, because it really is the test of the fabric of our democracy.
Well, how controversial was it at the time when it happened? Extremely
controversial. Like, it is about as controversial as it comes. As I said, this is an unelected representative of an unelected body overseas. This is the Queen's representative. Now, exactly how much the Queen knew has been the subject of so many essays and investigations and all the rest. The other part was how much and how often was John Kerr, the Governor-General at the time, communicating with Malcolm Fraser in the background, and how much did the opposition leader know about what was going on? The Governor-General should keep the Prime Minister up to date with their thinking on matters of constitutional crises, whatever the plural is, crisis,
whatever it is.
Exactly. We don't have many of them, so there's not that many. There's rarely a plural. But he didn't, and this came as a shock to Gough Whitlam, and therefore a shock to the country that had elected this man twice. Now, those that argue against that theory will say, well, what the Governor-General did was the fairest thing you can do, and that is send it to the people. If the government can't govern, send it back to the people. They can decide, and they did by pretty comprehensively booting Gough Whitlam out of office. But because of the drama, because of the eloquence and the wit of Gough Whitlam, those 15 words we uttered at the start of the show, that moment will live on, and Gough became martyred almost. You know, you rarely hear about the 2 elections he lost after being dismissed, but he remains a legend in the eyes of many from Labor, not just because of what he did, and there were huge reforms, but because of the way he went out and the political martyrdom that he received.
I think what struck me this week is, I mean, we are talking about something that happened 50 years ago, and yet we heard words from our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, that were really strong. He said, make no mistake, November 11th, 1975 was not a constitutional crisis. It was a partisan political ambush. 50 years later, Labor is still carrying those wounds.
They're angry about it, a Conservative conspiracy. It's funny hearing that from the Prime Minister, because Anthony Albanese, while I think he would name Gough Whitlam as one of those people he admires, and certainly Gough founded Medibank. Medibank became Medicare, and Medicare has been the backbone of 2 elections now for Anthony Albanese. He governs the current Prime Minister in a very different style to the style that Gough Whitlam governed in. He governs more like Menzies, more like the man that Gough Whitlam spent so long trying to get rid of, than he does Gough Whitlam. So this still burns in Labor heartland. I mean, Paul Keating told the story, and I can't remember ever hearing this story before, but Paul Keating told a story of how he, as a young frontbench member, a minister for I think 2 or 3 weeks he had been in Gough's ministry, went to Gough Whitlam and effectively advised him to get on the phone to the Queen, to at least make her aware of what on earth was going on here. But beyond that, to call in the police to arrest the Governor-General. Now, if that happens, then Gough Whitlam and Paul Keating discussed as well, the Governor-General could, as the head of state, could call in the army, and so then all of a sudden you've got 2 governments operating in one country, and this standoff, like that would be a real crisis. And we got close to it. So Paul Keating said that Gough Whitlam was a constitutionalist and someone that respected the system and therefore didn't hit back. There's a lot's been written about what Gough did after hearing the news, and he went for lunch and didn't perhaps fight or activate as quickly as he could his Senate members to block any bill that went through the Parliament from the Liberals straight after. There's a lot that went on in that time, and being back at Old Parliament House for all the events just had that feel of the history. You know, it's such a different place to this Parliament in just how close everything is, the smells, the sounds, the looks, and there'll now be a Whitlam statue that looks out over Canberra, the Prime Minister announced this week, that will just add to that feel. You know, they've done a great job, those involved, of making Old Parliament House sort of this replica to democracy in our system. And there's some great statues in and around the parliamentary triangle. You know, Curtin and Chifley out walking. They're the first two women in Parliament walking into the building. There's all these great sort of features that you know, Canberra's not a particularly old capital by world standards, so it's starting to get that feel with those kind of moments immortalised.
Yeah, I really like it. And I want to talk about another notable former Prime Minister who we heard from on this anniversary as well, but from the other side of politics, John Howard. You mentioned him too. I mean, we heard Anthony Albanese and Paul Keating talking about this partisan political ambush and, you know, calling in the cops on the Governor-General. John Howard, though, unsurprisingly, had a very different view of how this all played out.
Yeah, he did. He thought this was about as fair as you can go, with the Governor-General effectively stepping in and sending it back to the people. I think he said, you know, that's as democratic as it gets when I was speaking to him on the day. So, look, he believes the moves were justified by what happened at the election. You know, the Governor-General sent it to the people. The people said, well, it's time for a change, to use Gough's phrase. And that's what happened. I think this will be argued clearly for a long, long time to come. Two things stand out though, Jane. One is that this friendship remarkably formed in later life between Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser, the man who replaced him, the man who, you know, he really went after on those steps. We all remember the 15 words. There was a lot more said out there, and he went after Malcolm Fraser, not just then, but then
Kerr's Kerr, was it?
Yeah,
was that,
exactly.
That's the phrase, yeah.
Throughout the entire Maintain the Rage election campaign of 75. The rage was directed at the Governor-General, but also at the acting Prime Minister, at Fraser, and then they formed this unlikely and yet remarkable friendship in later life, which shows that despite all the differences, that bond of being Australian can endure. And then something that John Howard was really pointed about, he said that also our system endured. You know, this was the biggest test. A time when we were staring down the possibility we now know of two governments, of military standoff with police standoff, of Australians v Australians, a time when people were doubting the system we had set up from the very top down, from the Queen all the way through to the regular voting, and it survived. And you know, democracies and liberal democracies like ours are a minority sport. There's not that many of them. We're the exception rather than the rule, and we only survived because of what played out in the weeks after that and the years that then followed once everything had settled down.
So I wonder then, Charles, 50 years later, with the passage of time and the benefit of hindsight, are you brave enough to tell me who is right in this instance? Was it a constitutional crisis or was it a partisan political ambush?
Yeah. I mean, it was a constitutional crisis, clearly.
Yeah.
Anytime the Governor-General gets involved, I think that's pretty crisis levels because they're not elected. But then it's also clear that John Kerr liked being the centre of a story and put himself right in the middle, where he could have done more with the Prime Minister to avoid that situation. He could have, I mean, the simple act of saying to the Prime Minister, hey, if this doesn't get sorted out, you know, we're going back to the people. At least that threat would make it clear what the consequences were. I certainly think there was overreach from a Governor-General there. Thankfully, the likes we haven't seen since. And we know the system changed because they introduced the rule that if a senator can no longer sit in the Senate, be it through illness, death, whatever, that the replacement has to come from that party. That's the will of the people, and that's the sort of the underlying foundational problem behind this. It was all done over the corpse of a man, essentially, because of what happened in the Senate. So look, I think that's a really important change that we've seen play out, particularly in the last decade here with the citizenship scandals, and then into this sort of era we've had of people standing down and serving a couple of years and not serving out terms. They've always been replaced by someone from the party, and that's kept the balance in the Senate the way the voters intended, and that's important.
So do you think a Governor-General today would step in the same way, or has the kind of relationship between the head of state and the head of government changed, and our expectations of what that role is?
Yeah, I mean, there have been moments where it's looked vulnerable, right? These last, sort of, I think back to the end of Rudd Gillard years, the when it was a hung parliament, into even, you know, when Malcolm Turnbull, after the 2016 election, had a pretty slim majority and things started to fall apart when his leadership was challenged. There was some inside the party room that wondered whether this should go back to a campaign, and then state governments in particular have been through all that in recent years as well. I don't think they would. I think there would be pretty clear instructions to the Prime Minister. There are obviously better ways to do it now. You know, it's much easier to get in contact with the executive of a government rather than all the formalities that would have had to have gone on in 1975. It's easy to get in contact with constitutional experts, with lawyers, with solicitors general, governors general. There's more experience. It's a more mature democracy now, but I don't think we'll ever see a moment quite like that again. I mean, as a journo, geez, I'd love to cover it.
I know.
Yeah, hearing some of those people that were there in 75 talk about it. I used to love hearing stories that Laurie Oakes would tell about that day, and you know, you've worked in this building with Laurie and all the wisdom he had about Gough and being there and what those times were like. I mean, it's the stuff of dreams for a reporter, the stuff of nightmares for a democracy. So I think we'll take the sacrifice on that one for the sake of the country.
On that note, if our listeners do have time to check out the Age newspaper website, Tony Wright also wrote a lovely piece about being there that day as at the time a former journo who was a rock singer. And then later went back to being a journo. It's a good piece to have a read if you do have time. I was also struck, listening to you talk about this and how this kind of proved the strength of our political system, because there's kind of a parallel between what's recently happened in the US with the shutdown there. Donald Trump not able to pass his budget through the Senate, yet instead of, you know, the constitutional crisis Australian style, you've just had all these federal workers not getting paid.
Yeah, it's a remarkable difference, and even to the fact they just kick the ball down the road. Like the actual deal, I think, that's been signed to reopen the government only lasts until January. It's a continuing resolution. They're going to have to come back to this and come back to this and come back to this. Having your Prime Minister as part of the legislative body, as someone that sits and makes laws and is in the party room, I think works better. You know, the US were trying to get away from a king. That's why they gave the president one end of the street and gave Congress control, effectively, of the car keys. That Congress controls the money. To get away from that model of a king, they probably swung too far back the other way. At least in this circumstance here in Australia, the party that controls the Parliament, at least the House, is the party that is in power. In the US, and I think we're about to see that happen again in 2026, we've seen it so many times in the past, the party that controls Congress is often in opposition to the president, and so that just creates almost a permanent state of dysfunction, particularly in these polarised times when the idea of sitting down with your enemy, like Fraser and Whitlam did, having that long-running friendship like John McCain and Joe Biden did, like that just seems unlikely and less likely these days, particularly in the States.
Kind of another reason to be thankful that we have the political system that we do and the Australian Electoral Commission overseeing all matters politics here. Charles, you've kind of alluded to this, but I'm just wondering if you can give us a bit of personal insight into Tuesday's events. As a political journalist in 2025, working in, we can't even call it New Parliament House anymore, can we? It's just Parliament House.
Yeah.
But what was it like to kind of relive that historic moment in the building where it happened with a lot of the people who were there at the time?
Yeah, it was awesome. It was a dream. There was a moment when John Howard was speaking, and sort of four of us from Nine got to sneak up to the press gallery and sit in the old press gallery in the old House of Representatives and watch John Howard speak, which was amazing. And looking out at the front benches were all these sort of legends of politics and of governing. It wasn't just the politicians, the people that have been behind the scenes were there as well. And having all of them sitting in the reps chamber was really cool. And just one of those moments. It's just fun, right? And it's for an event that was so traumatic for the country, to be able to sit there and hear these people all talk about that moment. It was very special, and you know, we're lucky enough to have people in our office that have worked in the old building, have all that experience and knowledge and wisdom, and hearing the way they describe how that building worked compared to this one, and also, you know, then talking to those that were there on the day, and just the calamity and the chaos of it all, particularly without these things. You just imagine what that was like, having to work out what on earth was going on without a text or a group chat or
social media,
being able to duck aside and call an MP. You had to sort of go and press the flesh, and that's what they were doing. It's a different system to what operates now, but it would have been a hell of a day or a hell of a period there in the lead up to Christmas. And of course, we've been through so much as a country in those 3 years in the lead up to that. So just incredible time.
Absolutely. Well, I've enjoyed your insight today, Charles Croucher. Thank you for joining us on Today's Take.
Thanks, Jane.
And thank you for listening. Please do give us a rating or a follow and join us again next week for another episode. I'm Jane Azzopardi. Until then, I'll see you bright and early with the rest of the Today team. Have a great day.